When I first encountered Shakespeare's Julius Caesar as a kid, I felt that Brutus was the villain because he murdered someone. In high school and college, I vaguely felt that Caesar was more villainous because he was attempting to establish a dictatorship instead of a republic. While rewatching the play, I realized that Shakespeare's audience was living under a monarchy, so they would not have the automatic pro-republic reaction that I had. Later, I remembered in Dante's Inferno, Brutus ends up in the ninth circle, so historically he has been seen as a rather villainous. But in the modern play movie version, they show Caesar as very unsympathetic. I know Shakespeare can be nuanced enough to show both sides and tell a story with moral ambiguity. However, do you think Shakespeare's audience was biased towards a side? Do you think Shakespeare took a side? How best can I keep my modern biases from clouding my view of the classics? Well, really by asking questions such as this, of course. And by the frame of reference that you are raising is a really important one, right? Who is the audience and what are they likely to think, and how can we avoid reading our own set of attitudes? And I think one thing we could say is, yes, Shakespeare's audience was living under a monarchy, but their view, remember, of course, that there's monarchies and monarchies, right? And even in antiquity, there was a distinction between a monarchy and a tyranny, right? The monarchy is where the ruler rules for the good of the people. The tyranny is where the ruler rules for the sake of his own power and his own benefit. This stretches way, way back to Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, and all of this is, well-trodden ground for us as well. And I think that, the Elizabethan audience would have been unlikely to look back on the collapse of Rome's republic with with a sense of great joy and delight, as if this was like a great moment in history, in part because, they themselves had been through over and over again in ways that we've talked about, transitions out of absolute monarchy, out of the despotism, the potential despotism of absolute rule by one. They had Magna Carta after the disastrous rule during, and then after the disastrous rule of King John. They've had, shortly after this, they're going to have a regicide, right? So there's brewing even more Republican sentiment. But even before before that regicide, before Charles and all of that disaster, the British have a real sense of the interplay of different roles in society, including, Parliament and the nobles and so forth. And even though they're not even though they're at this point they're not a republic, they are a monarchy. Nevertheless, they have a I would imagine they would have a real sympathy with the republican ideal of Rome. And you can read, of course, accounts of Roman history that bear this out from the time period. But, nevertheless, it does mean what you say is true, that Caesar isn't necessarily the villain simply because he wants a crown, right? But I think that Shakespeare, and this is the other thing, right? If we can think our way into Shakespeare's head and his audience's head, we could also know that Shakespeare can think his way into the Romans' head, right? And for the Romans, a crown is just the symbol of all that could possibly go wrong, right? Because of the reasons I enumerated, right? The Republic begins with the exile of the king, and that, and then is established essentially to keep anybody from ever taking that kind of power again, in much the same way that Magna Carta had been. So for the Brits, I think the analog to the Roman Republic might be the Magna Carta, right? Might be that there are these sort of once you go through a terrible period of despotic rule, you place bulwarks in place to try to keep that from happening ever again. And the last thing that I'll say is, Shakespeare actually is nuanced enough to show both sides. I think that ultimately with the duplicity of Antony, with the kind of double dealing of Antony, and with indeed some of the sympathy that we have, I think, for Brutus and his turmoil, his back and forth, we are invited to see the thing from their perspective, to wish at least that the Republic could endure, even if ultimately it's suggested that, the tragedy is that the Republic was dying, and that no one man could really have changed that, except Caesar if he'd given up power. And that's why, Caesar's ambition is a real thing. I'm going to read one last speech here that kind of countermands what I just said, so that to prove your point about the nobility of Caesar also in the play, right? There's a wonderful exchange with Caesar and Calpurnia when she's trying to get him not to go out. She's afraid he's going to die. She's had a premonition. Caesar says, "What can be avoided whose end is purposed by the mighty gods? Yet Caesar shall go forth. For these predictions are to the world in general as to Caesar." Calpurnia says, "When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes." Caesar says, "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Of all the wonders that I have yet heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come." That too, a very stoic attitude, and a famous line, very beautiful, right? Cowards die many times before their deaths. a sentiment that we still quote. That's a very quotable line, and yet in the mouth of Caesar, who we recognize, I think, even from the perspective of the play, as having seized authority that is not only illegitimate but will eventually unseat and destroy the republic. And so I would think that the British audience would be sympathetic to Brutus's claims, and even think that there's a right answer here for how you ought to rule yourself, especially in the Roman context. But at the same time, right, Caesar acts, at least, as for all the reasons that we've been talking about now for 2 episodes. He shows himself aware of this. Like, if fate has called up my number, then what can I do? I only can act, right? I can't know what's going to happen, but if it's fated, right, I want to live courageously, right? I don't want to die 1,000 deaths as a coward, but to die one death as a brave man. And this ambiguity has been present since the beginning. So I think Shakespeare's putting that there without really. I don't think he plunks for imperium for the empire in this play, but I do think that he recognizes the greatness of Caesar, as indeed everybody did. Even his detractors.